So about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to bring a group of airmen to an artificial intelligence conference in Silicon Valley. And while we were in the middle of one of the lectures, I was sitting there, I was focused on the speaker, and I'm trying to pay attention. And all of a sudden, all this movement keeps happening in my peripheral vision. I look over, and the airmen that I brought them to Silicon Valley, they got to see Google, they got to see Facebook, they were all over the place. It was a really cool trip. They weren't even paying attention to the speaker. They were scribbling notes, they were talking to each other, and at one point, they caused so much commotion that they stood up and they left. Now, I wanted to know what was going on, but I still wanted to hear what was going on in the stage and with the speaker, and so I stuck around. After the speaker was done, I immediately got up. I wanted to understand what was so important that they had to leave the stage immediately. And so I started looking for them. It took me about 15 or 20 minutes. It was a large convention center. And at one point, I turned the corner and I saw this scene. Now, what I didn't understand is a few weeks before, these airmen had rallied around a problem. Now, the problem had to do with the way that we task fighter aircraft in the Middle East. The details really aren't important. But what is important is these airmen are not part of a program office. They're not part of higher headquarters. They had not been tasked to solve this problem, but they all had a passion for it. And something that was said in that lecture actually sparked an idea. It was an idea so important that they had to immediately leave the room and start working on it. So for the next 2 days, these airmen sat right there at that desk in the hallway of the convention center, didn't attend the rest of the conference, and continued to write software. Within a few weeks, that software was actually pushed down range, and it was tested in the CAOC in the Middle East. A few months later, it was handed off to Air Force Research Lab, again, in concert with these airmen, and right now it is scheduled to go on our next Intel weapon system, where it'll be used by 5,000 people every single day. Now, the interesting thing is these airmen aren't unique. These airmen came from a unit that has actually funded and sponsored 15 similar cross-functional teams. And those teams have focused on a wide array of areas, starting with artificial intelligence, moving on into drone operations, into cloud computing, talent management. And out of those 15 prototypes and those 15 cross-functional teams, 11 have actually been scaled across the entire Air Force or were within months of being pushed into a program of record. Now, a lot of people will ask, how did this unit do it? And the only thing that I can think of is that we trained our airmen to be entrepreneurs. So if you actually take a look at the National Defense Strategy, you'll quickly see that the Air Force and really the United States as a whole is shifting to a strategic focus on near-peer competition. Now, this focus is often talked about, but the difficult part is whenever you're trying to write any sort of foreign policy or an actual strategy to go against foreign policy, is you forget sometimes that the countries that you're dealing with are made up of unique individuals. Those individuals have their own goals, their own desires, and their own dreams. And that forces a future that's almost impossible to predict. Now, when you listen to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Secretary of the Air Force, they'll often talk about this future in the same breath as hypersonic weapons, multi-domain operations, and other emerging technologies. They'll talk about the fact that we have to build something called the Air Force we need. This Air Force that's going to be ready for whatever strategic challenge or tactical challenge comes our way. Now, my question to you is, what if we were to develop an entire Air Force full of those airmen that I just showed? What if we developed an Air Force full of airmen, officers, enlisted, civilians of every single type that were comfortable with acquisitions, emerging technology, and could quickly pivot to any challenge? So we started to do that within our own organization. Now, originally, when we had some of our initial successes, we had a few organizations reach out, and they said, how are you doing this? What is the checklist that we can use to replicate it? And at the time, we really didn't have anything. So we sat down, we brainstormed around a table, and we came up with a simple 3-step process. Step 1 was find a problem. Step 2, try a solution. And step 3, if that solution fails, try again. You see, we understood that from the very beginning, failure was going to happen. So we had to create a repeatable process, something that our airmen could go through as quickly as possible, because we wanted to expect experiential learning and failure from the very beginning. And we needed them to get through that process and increase that cycle time so we could get through those failures, we could catalog those lessons learned, and get to whatever success we were moving forward with. Now, while we liked the checklist, it really didn't answer every single need that we had or that our customers or different people that we were working with had. And so what we looked at is, instead of building an actual set checklist and something to deviate from, we wanted some key ingredients. So we looked back at things that we had done, and we figured out what were the ingredients for success and what were the things that we thought we could replicate over multiple organizations. So the first thing we talked about was building sandboxes. We needed to make sure we had both virtual and physical spaces for our airmen to experiment, prototype, and play. One of the difficult things about the military, much of what we do is built to prevent the catastrophic loss of life. And these are not areas that you can play, experiment, or just try something new. And so as leaders, we had to dig into those areas. We had to dig into every single process, identify the risk, mitigate the risk, and then find a safe way for our airmen to experiment. We also had to move forward with an idea. The idea was that not every single publication, instruction, policy, and procedure was simply the best way we knew how to do things yesterday. Now, this doesn't mean that we looked at every single procedure and we changed it for the sake of change, but we looked at every single procedure to see if it was still the best way we knew how to do things. And the moment that it wasn't, we changed it. What this did is it allowed our airmen to approach problems with a beginner's mind. It allowed them to look at problems openly and not just immediately discount it based on some sort of personal bias or a belief that the leadership or someone above them would never let it fly. The next thing we did was started to create a network. See, a lot of the things that we were jumping into at the time dealt with technologies, and we didn't have that expertise within our unit. We needed a process that we could pivot quickly to whatever was coming our way. And so we first started internally with the Air Force and the Department of Defense, and then we started to establish our network externally, both with academia and industry. Now, this allowed our airmen to actually make a phone call or go out to a meeting and talk to experts in those fields. And that way we could remove a roadblock or jump into a new arena without too much prep work. What it also did is it exposed us to a group of people that thought differently than us. They had never been to basic training. They had never been to tech school. And so they just approached problems in a different way. And that's not to say that their way was better or our way was better, but when you coupled the two, some amazing things started to happen. It also exposed us to a group of people that had a passion for service, but just never got a chance to serve. And this gave them an outlet for that passion, and they were more than happy to help us with some of the most wicked problems we had in the Air Force. Now, it was great for us to actually pick up a phone or go to a meeting, but we quickly found out that if we were able to create an immersion opportunity, some sort of fellowship, so these airmen could immerse themselves for weeks or months at a time, we could exponentially increase not only the value to the organization, but the knowledge that they had. And so we began to work with companies and groups like Hacking for Defense. You heard from Pete Newell earlier. This was a great opportunity because what it ended up doing is we would bring a van load of airmen. They would go from Beale Air Force Base and they would head down to Stanford. And throughout that day, they would audit a graduate level business class with the students. And then for the rest of the evening, they would brainstorm and whiteboard a potential solution to an Air Force problem. Now the best part, over the next semester, they continued this process until at the end of the semester, the output was a brief to higher headquarters within the Air Force and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Now, many of these prototypes or ideas or recommendations have actually been pushed up and have either been scaled at the headquarters level or have been used in some sort of form or fashion. And this wasn't unique to the Air Force. The entire Department of Defense was taking advantage of this opportunity. We then started working with AFWorks and NSIN to create a fellowship. We would look out about 6 months into the distance and we would start to think of what kind of technology did we need expertise within our unit. We would then work with these organizations to build a fellowship. We would send somebody to a startup, to a company, it didn't really matter where, somewhere where they could learn this firsthand. And then they would bring that back to the organization and use that to prototype over and over again. Now the final ingredient, if we were successful and if we had done this right, we would have airmen who actually had experience in the field, had knowledge, and had a deep Rolodex. And so the last thing that we wanted to do was stand in their way. So we began to champion every single idea we had. Now, our organization took a lot of flack from this at first. People would argue that there's no way that we can champion every single idea. First off, not all ideas are ready. We also do not have unlimited manpower and unlimited resources, and they were correct in all those assumptions. But I'll tell you, if we want to pride ourselves on being a force that expects experiential learning and failure from the very beginning, we have to understand that when an airman brings us an idea, we're not actually championing the idea itself, but we're championing the airman. And when those airmen understand that they can bring us anything and no idea is too small or too big, it starts to shift our organizational culture to one where every single airman, from the commander down, understands that they will never let their position in our organization dictate their impact on the world. Now, if we look back at these three airmen, the airman on the right, about a year after this picture was taken, got out of the military. using some of the prototypes that he developed while he was in, he transitioned to the National Geospatial Agency, where he's now building cloud computing solutions on JWICS, our top secret network. The airman in the middle, he immediately attended one of those fellowships that I discussed. He went to a startup that built talent management and task management software. He then brought that knowledge back and started with task management because we didn't have anything that could do what we needed it to on secret or on our secret internet on SIPRNet. He then coupled that with talent management and team management. The most interesting thing about that prototype is the ideas and the lessons learned have actually scaled, and we're using them in an Air Force-wide talent management initiative, starting on with the first sergeants and then moving on to our military training instructors. The code from that software actually transitioned as well and is now part of that same Intel weapon system that I discussed earlier, again, where it will be used by over 5,000 personnel every single day. The airman on the left, shortly after this picture was taken, was selected to become the very first enlisted intelligence airman in the Air Force's Education with Industry program. Him and his family, PCS to Amazon, and he stayed there a year. He started working robotics, then moved on to cloud computing, and then after that started working machine learning. Now, around the time that his time in the fellowship was over, we began an Air Force accelerator with MIT focusing on artificial intelligence. He was the perfect candidate for this position. He was actually supposed to come back to us, but we knew it would be better for his development and better for the Air Force if he moved. And so we transitioned him to MIT, where he's there now, leading and working artificial intelligence solutions for the entire Air Force. Now, I know that the world stage is dynamic, and we have no idea what challenges are going to present to ourselves or what we're going to be presented with in the future. But I can tell you that we have the most amazing Air Force in the world. And when we as leaders can find a way to align the passions of our airmen with the partners of our nation, we will create the Air Force we need and the airmen we need for that future. And so my question to all of you is, who are the entrepreneurs within your own organizations? And how might you become the leaders that they need? Thank you.